All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on this third day of the Stanford WebCamp. Today we're going to be talking about how we can simplify the admin experience, basically make the site easier to use, I would say, particularly for less technical users. And we're going to be talking in specifics around Drupal, but also covering some higher level principles that I think would apply, whether it's WordPress or headless or a variety of other kind of CMS approaches. So my name is Martin Anderson Klutz on Drupal.org or Twitter, LinkedIn, other social platforms. I go by Manclue. I'm certified for Drupal, but I'm also certified for UX by the Nielsen Norman Group. And I currently work for Northern, which is in London, Ontario, Canada. So I would say it's fair to say that Drupal has a reputation of being a bit harder to learn, has a steeper learning curve than maybe some other CMS products that are out there. But as sort of site builders and developers, we definitely have the power to make it substantially easier. And so we're going to talk about some specific approaches. In the slides, we're going to talk about even some specific modules that you can use. And I have links in here, and I'm going to make those slides available later so that if you want to use that as a reference to potentially use some of those modules on your own Drupal site, you're certainly welcome to do that. So we're going to start with a demo. This is essentially a fresh Drupal 9 install. There's no contributed modules or any custom code here. Just a little bit of custom configuration. So we're going to log in here. By default, Drupal only has one user role. And so we're logging in as that admin user. And you can see that as soon as you log in, it takes you to this user page where there isn't necessarily kind of a clear next thing to do. So from here, there are tabs where you can edit your shortcuts for the toolbar. You can edit your user account. But there's no sort of clear indication of what's the next thing you should do as an editor. We could go to the home page. If we've been trained to know to use the toolbar, we would know to go up to the content and look at our sort of content dashboard that's up here. And then once we're here, we have a call to action to add content. But then once we click there, we have a list of content types. We have to choose one of those to actually get into the process of creating content. By default, Drupal doesn't enforce having to enter these kind of descriptors in terms of which, for each content type, some context around what they're meant for or how they're meant to be used. That's really up to you. And so I sort of tried to show, in a way, almost a worst case scenario in terms of creating these content types without any of those descriptors. But let's go ahead and create an event. So let's just say test event. And you can see right off the bat that there's actually a lot going on in this form. So in addition to having quite a number of fields in the main column here, we've also got the sidebar that has a variety of different field sets, each of which have their own fields within them. Now, let's say for the sake of this demo that we want our event to be on May the 10th at 11 a.m. and run until May the 10th at 12 noon. And you can see that in the process of just putting in that simple date range, there were a number of things that I had to do twice because Drupal's core date range field doesn't have any sense of duration that sort of ties those two things together. So you have to sort of manually enter all of those changes one by one. And then let's assign it which type of an event we want to call it. And now let's assume that we want to associate this with a location, but now as we go to search for it, we realize that it's not there. So unfortunately, working with Drupal core, our only option now is to back out. A savvy user could know that you could probably open up another browser tab to create our location. But let's assume again that we're kind of more of a novice user. And let's say we want to set this to Bishop Auditorium. And let's set it to the address. Fortunately, for the sake of this demo, I have all of this cached in my autocomplete, so that saves us some time for this. So now that we have our location, we can go back to content and go back through the process of creating our event again. And so let's set this to time again. Update it again on destination. our other selections, and now that's associated with our location that we just created. And so then having saved that, we have all of our content, but as we could see, that was actually not as intuitive as it could have been. And so let's start to dig into some ways that we can make that process easier. So for starters, if anybody's not familiar with this book, I would definitely recommend this as a way to up your game on the usability side. Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, is, it's not a long read, it's a short book. So I would definitely recommend sort of getting yourself a copy and then taking an afternoon to get through it. There's a variety of different recommendations in there. A lot of them are really meant more towards website visitors as opposed to editors, but I think a lot of the core principles really apply to both. And in particular, I would say maybe the main point of the book is this idea that every page should be self-evident or at least self-explanatory. And I think if you approach how you configure and build out your CMS with that philosophy in mind, I think you're going to do a lot of good for your users in terms of making that editorial experience as easy as possible. And so really the goal is to make it obvious how to perform every kind of a content management task. Obviously, a lot of the same UX principles will apply. You want to establish kind of a clear visual hierarchy, in this case on the back-end side of things. Keep your link colors and some of those other elements, even sort of visual treatment of fields and forms and all of those things consistent across the site so that it becomes less confusing for your users. Definitely you want to be descriptive. So we talked earlier on about how you can put the descriptive text in for your content types. You can do the same thing on fields. If you're using, let's say, icons as part of your navigation, you definitely want to have text labels for those at the very least on hover, but it's going to be even more intuitive if they're always visible. You don't want to rely on just the icons and assume that people understand what they mean. Where you have validation constraints on a particular field, you definitely want to be explicit in terms of making sure that the user will know those before they submit the form, as they're entering the data. So if there are particular input patterns that they're going to be expected to follow, make sure that the help text is there to really clearly communicate that. And the same thing with, let's say, something like a password field where there might be certain characters that are either not permitted or there are requirements in terms of, let's say, it has to have a lowercase letter, an uppercase letter, a number, and punctuation. Telling them that before they submit the form is going to make that experience much easier for your editors. In terms of the language that you use on your site, you also want to, as much as possible, try and avoid what I would call Drupalism. So things like nodes, entity, and media for people who are familiar with Drupal and probably developers. They're going to have no trouble deciphering those, but somebody who's hired specifically for kind of writing or content entry is going to find those unfamiliar. And so to the extent that you can use familiar, relevant, and really meaningful labels, more like alert, events, and images are going to be much easier to understand without any training. I would also encourage you to think about almost like tiers of complexity. So Drupal is great for having the ability to configure different roles with different permissions. And so try and think about having a role that's really specifically geared towards your less technical users and make that experience as simple as possible. And then maybe have, let's say, an editor role that's one level above that in terms of sort of the complexity, but also the power of what they're able to do. And then you might even want a role that is a tier above that in terms of let's say now being able to manage users or manage some site configuration, some of those other tasks. But because you can create those roles, you really have the opportunity to sort of marry up the amount of complexity and power to the sort of technical sophistication of a particular set of users. Sometimes when you're setting up a site, you're also trying to find the right balance between sort of power and configurability versus more simplified single purpose tasks. So a good example that I like to think of is the media library WYSIWYG button, which can open up the media library. But oftentimes when a user is seeing Drupal for the first time, they may not understand what media really is. And so if you could have 3 individual buttons that are for placing images, for placing videos, or for linking to documents, that's going to be a lot more intuitive for people the first time they sit down in front of it. The right answer in terms of how particular roles should be configured, and that balance between sort of configurability and single purpose, more explicit tasks, is really going to be different from site to site based on the things that the site needs to do and the types of users that are trying to do them. But that balance will potentially also change over time. So when somebody first starts using a site, they're likely going to be much more comfortable with a very simple, very explicit kind of user interface. But over time, they're probably going to be more comfortable with having some additional, maybe more complicated features added to it. And in terms of the WYSIWYG, I would encourage you to think about maybe making basic HTML, leaving that as the default, and then as you need to add more complicated kind of WYSIWYG options, having those in the full HTML so that they can really be used when needed, as opposed to something that people have to sort of mentally parse out every time they go to add content. Also think about where are the places within the site that you can reduce friction. I like to try and think about how we can make every click count. And so as we saw when we used the default site, we had to do multiple clicks just to get A, to the content interface, and then B, from there to where we're actually creating content. So modules like the admin toolbar or the coffee modules can give your editors the power to get where they're wanting to go in sort of a single click. And then you can also do things like use the login and logout redirect per role, so that as soon as they log in, they're immediately taken to a place that's sort of like, the primary place where they need to conduct their management of the site, sort of a thing. And so as developers and site builders, the more that we can think about not only what we want users to do, but where we want them to end up when they're done that, we're going to make the site feel a lot more intuitive for them. You may also want to think about, are there ways that we can keep people in the context of what they're doing? So let's say we have an event calendar on the website. Instead of expecting people to remember that if they want to add an event to that content calendar, they have to go sort of up to a content menu and then down to add content and then over to event. We have the ability to put links directly into that content calendar so that there's sort of a clear and obvious prompt right there to create the content that's going to contribute to that page that they're looking at. Obviously, that's something we want to expose for editors only. But the other thing that we can do is even allow them to complete some of those tasks in that same context, particularly for simple things. But for more complex tasks, we might be able to do something like, so going back to our event example, if it's a simple form, we could say, open that form in the settings tray so that they can enter the content and then stay in with that content or event calendar visible. But if it's a more complex form, then we might want to take them off to that form as kind of a separate page load, but then return them back to that content or event calendar when they're done. There are 2 modules here, Add Content by Bundle and Display Link Plus, that can help you to provide those sort of editor-only links and have some control in terms of where they get taken to complete those tasks. So here's an example of that. This is an example website where we've got a set of quick links at the top of the homepage, which are accessible to kind of any anonymous user. Well, once you're logged in as an editor, now you can see we have these sort of clear and obvious calls to action. And if you were to click to add a link, you can see that the form opens up because there's only a small amount of information that we need to provide. Or if we click Manage Links, we have the ability to drag and drop to sort those and save that, or potentially open up a contextual menu to edit or perform other actions. So you can see, without having to go anywhere else on the site or remember a particular place in the navigation to go and edit this, we've made it really easy for editors to manage that part of the site. You may also want to think about, are there ways that we can assist our editors by providing them some immediate feedback? So instead of having to go off to other third-party sites to do things like check accessibility, we could use the Editorial module, which is new and pretty user-friendly, to give them some feedback on, let's say, a piece of content that they've just saved. If they want to assess how that content is going to look on, let's say, a mobile device, we can use this responsive preview module to give them a widget they can use for that. And if SEO is something that our editors are going to be sort of closely monitoring, then we can use this real-time SEO module to even directly within the form, start to give them some feedback in terms of, is there too low or too high a keyword density? Should they be trying to use a particular keyword in some headings and some of those kinds of things? And from a configuration standpoint, one thing I like to try and do is, if users are required to choose media, let's say we've got a hero image field on a page, to have the preview within the form crop to the same proportions as the hero image is going to appear on the rendered page. And that way, even before they click to save that piece of content, they're already getting feedback in terms of how that cropping is going to work. And then if you've got a tool like, let's say, Focal Point, they can adjust that in real time without having to sort of save it and assess, whether that was a good outcome. Let's talk a little bit about forms and how we can optimize them for this kind of an experience. So in terms of field usability, obviously you want to make your required fields clearly indicated. Drupal does a decent job of this out of the box, but particularly if you're using custom themes, you want to make sure that that's something that gets preserved. Wherever you can, provide sensible defaults. So if you've got a field that 90% of the time is going to be the same value, then it might make sense to provide that as a default value so that an editor doesn't have to sort of mentally expend energy to provide the most common use case. Placeholder text tends to have a number of usability issues. So particularly from a contrast standpoint, if it's too dark, people may mistake it for being a default value and assume that they don't have to edit that default value. If it's too light, it may have contrast issues and be something that people with the inability to distinguish lower levels of contrast may not even see it. The other, I would say, more concerning usability issue is that as soon as people start to type in that field, they lose that placeholder text. And so if the placeholder text is meant to communicate something like, let's say, a pattern for a product ID, then as soon as they start typing, they've lost that reference. And so at a minimum, you should, with that kind of user feedback, have that explicitly in the help text so that as they start to type in that field, they have that reference in there. If your field has more than one action button, so by default, Drupal will have save, but also preview, make sure that there's a clear visual hierarchy in terms of which one they want to do to save. And it's usually best practice to really never have a clear or reset button. Particularly in Drupal, if somebody just doesn't want to save their work, they can usually just either close the window or hit the back button and go do something else. But there are far too many examples of where usability studies have shown it's a source of frustration if somebody thinks that they're saving, but they accidentally click that reset button. From a usability standpoint, it's also often much better for your editors to use radio buttons, particularly if it's a small set of options. So you can see that just by looking at the radio buttons, you immediately are able to distinguish what options are available. And with a single click, you can sort of make your selection. Whereas with a dropdown, you have to click to open it, then you can read your options, and then you have to make a second click to be able to make your choice. In terms of making multiple selections, definitely checkboxes are going to be easier than this kind of a multi-select widget, because I would say outside of the CMS space, I feel like people don't tend to encounter these too often. And so somebody who's, let's say, a first-time web editor may not really understand without some guidance or training in terms of how to actually successfully use one of these widgets. And if you are using a select that has a lot of values, then you can use the select to or chosen libraries. And there are Drupal modules for those. I forgot to link those. To provide search within those, which can make it much easier for editors to be able to find a particular value that they're looking for. Also a good idea to really remove any elements that aren't needed. We've definitely seen in some of the training that we've done that editors can get confused if content types that, let's say, based on the site configuration, really don't have the capability to appear on the front page, but they have these default promote to front checkboxes. They may create a piece of content and click that and then be confused as to why it isn't appearing on the home page. And so if you have some of those default elements that actually serve no functional purpose on your website, it's a good idea to use something like the simplify module to basically hide them so that it's not going to create any confusion for your users. If you have fields that really are meant to be used only by, let's say, a certain tier of user, you can use the field permissions module to hide them and really only expose them, let's say, to your admin users. In terms of reference fields, like we saw on the event form, linking off to the location, the inline entity form can provide a much better experience by actually allowing you within that parent form to create new related content. And it also provides the option to customize the labels, again, to make them more specific and fit tighter in with the context. So you can say, image or contact, or as we'll see in a minute, location, instead of just saying like entity or node. Jacob Nielsen was one of the early pioneers of web usability, and he had, they refer to it as Jacob's Law, which is basically that users spend most of their time on other websites, which means when they come to your site, they prefer it to work the same way as all of the sites that they're already used to using. And so it's good to have innovation in mind, but if you directly sort of contravene the way common things work, then it's going to be more challenging for users to use your site, and it's going to be less intuitive. And so, from, I would say, an anonymous browsing perspective, they talk about conventions like, having the logo linked to home and in the top left, and the search bar in the top right are ways that your users, wherever they land on the website, kind of have at least those 2 points of orientation. But there are also, conventions around the way specific kinds of fields might act. And so within Drupal, there's this address module that provides a set of fields for collecting location information. In that case, they also happen to have integration for, geocoding and mapping, if that's something that you think might be on your roadmap. But I think even just for kind of the interface that they provide is useful as a starting point. And if your website needs to capture kind of date and time information, then the Smart Date module provides an interface that's much closer to something like your users might be used to from, let's say, Google Calendar or Microsoft Outlook. In the same way that you would want to think about the visual hierarchy of a public-facing website, you want to do the same thing with your forms. So you want to have your most important form elements first. Obviously, anything that's required is going to be important, and so should be high up. You also want to think about, are there ways to sort of visually group related fields in their labels? And so the field group module can be a good solution for that. And in general, what the UX research tells us is that a single column of fields is more intuitive for users than having kind of a multi-column layout, even though from a design standpoint, it may look prettier. Consistency is also going to be important. So if you can, try and roughly keep the organization of the form kind of the same sort of layout and structure as the way it's presented visually. And so if a user sees something that they need to fix on a page, when they click through to edit, they'll have kind of it'll be easier for them to orient themselves within the form in terms of where to find that piece of data that they need to update. Also, doing things like naming the same widgets the same way across different sort of content types is going to keep the overall experience more intuitive, because if you've got one content type where you've got an image field that's called images and another content type where you've got an image field that's called pictures, the editor may wonder, is there some functional difference between the two that is the reason for those things being called different things? Also, I would encourage you to really try and design for the typical use case. I know my own experience in building higher ed websites is that over time, you can start to add a lot of different fields that are really meant to address kind of more edge cases. And so you can start to have, you know, a content form that might have, you know, dozens and dozens of different fields. Again, many of them really meant to address very specific edge cases. And so if you can, it might be a good idea to group a lot of those fields that aren't commonly needed into some kind of either, you know, a tab or a collapsible field set, so that on a day-to-day basis, editors aren't having to sort of parse over things that really aren't necessary for, again, the common use case. In the same way, if you've got WYSIWYG plugins that are really only needed for special cases, so let's say you've got a plugin to, you know, embed a map or a web form directly into your content, and it's not something that is commonly going to be needed. It might be good to have that in more of like a secondary text format, like a full HTML, so that on a day-to-day basis, you're keeping that experience of content creation as simple as possible. There is also a module called form mode control. Drupal out of the box has the ability to define different form modes in the same way that you can define different view modes. So you could have two versions of your event form, one that's meant to, you know, be very exhaustive and provide fields for every possible use case, but you could also have a simplified version of that form. For example, maybe if you wanted to provide that in the settings tray so that you can provide that in context. And this form mode control will give you the ability to append a URL parameter so that you can allow users to use those different form modes for content entry. Also keep in mind that it's not always going to be smooth sailing. Your users are going to hit rough patches and have things go wrong. And so it's also important to think about the alerts and making sure that the errors that are going to be given to the users are going to be descriptive enough not to let them know not only that something has gone wrong, but what's gone wrong, and most importantly, what they can do to fix it. Also, you don't want to have those editors show in any kind of a modal or pop-up, because then once they've dismissed those, they've lost the details in terms of what it is that they need to fix. So that's going to sort of put some cognitive load in terms of forcing them to remember that. There is also the inline form errors module in core for Drupal 8 and 9, which actually improves not only the usability, but even the accessibility of those error messages by putting them right next to the form element that needs to be fixed, and then putting a summary at the top with links to each form element that has issues. So all of that being said, let's look at another demo that incorporates some of these ideas that we've talked about. So I'm going to switch to an author role and go to this website that has some of these features built in. And let's go ahead and log in. And having logged in, you can see that it automatically took us to our content dashboard where we could review some existing content. We could click here the same way we could on the other site, but now we also have this toolbar so we can go directly to create our events. So now let's go through the same process. You can see now we've got this smart date widget that gives us, you know, application style simplified entry. So here we can change just the day, and let's set the time to be 11 a.m. And you can see with just those two changes, it's automatically set the end based on the duration for us. So that's a big time saver. Set our performance, and now you can see within the form we have the ability, we could say, let's create our location right here, or in this case, let's cancel that and let's add our existing one. And once we've saved that, we can save that. In this example, we've actually added a workflow here. So as an author, I can look at my content and then decide I'm going to submit that for review. So having done that, now we'll switch to an editor role, which, as we talked about, has a little bit more complexity added to their role because it's meant to be a slightly more sophisticated user. So if we refresh this now on our moderated content dashboard, we can see the content that's just been created. As an editor, I can go in and I have the ability to do a mobile preview. For some reason, this being a live demo, there always has to be something go wrong. That's how you know it's actually being done live. And for today, that's the piece that's not working. So we can go in and look at that. There is For the editor, you can see they have the ability to do some additional edits. They have the ability to actually publish this. They can edit some of the meta tags. They can customize the URL alias that's being generated automatically, which is something that the author was not able to do. And then they also have access to this real-time SEO widget. Without content, it's not really going to show us any useful information. If that's something you'd be interested in seeing potentially demoed in the Q&A at the end, then we can maybe address that. But I also wanted to show down here is that editorially widget. In this case, because it's a pretty simple set of content, there's no user accessibility errors. But this is a pretty nice widget that will automatically scan your content and highlight any accessibility errors that you might need to see. So we can go ahead and say, as an editor, I want to publish that, and now our content is live. So hopefully you can see how much easier an experience that is, and partly because we've broken out the complexity between those two roles, kept the author role as simple as possible, and then given a little bit more to the editor as a more technical user. Let's switch back now to our presentation and talk a little bit around dynamic layouts. So definitely it's getting more and more common that websites want to allow their editors to have control over not only the content that's being published, but also how it's structured. Within Core, the primary solution for that is Layout Builder. And it's not only a very visual way of laying out content, but it's actually pretty accessible. So as a keyboard user, you can actually customize the layout, which I think is a pretty significant achievement. You can use Layout Builder to customize the default layout of a content type. So to say, I want all of my events to be laid out in this particular way, or you can allow customization on sort of a per piece of content basis. So you could say, I'm going to let editors customize the layout of every individual event, as an example. In my experience, Layout Builder adds a pretty significant amount of complexity. And so probably want to use that sparingly, particularly if you've got less technical users kind of doing that site management. And you may even want to think about having a particular content type defined specifically for using Layout Builder. So like almost like a landing page content type. There are also some modules that can help to sort of reduce that complexity. There's a module called Layout Builder Restrictions that allows you to sort of explicitly define which fields and blocks will be available within Layout Builder, which can significantly improve the experience of using that. There's also a module called Layout Builder Lock that will give you the ability to set some parameters, almost like put up guide rails to prevent your users from maybe making changes that could be detrimental or bad decisions. So for example, you might be able to say only let an editor add new content at the bottom of the page or only at the top of the page, or say these blocks can't be used in that region, some of those kinds of things. There's also a module called Layout Builder Library, which can be a good alternative to giving your editors the ability to sort of make any layout that they want as sort of, let's say, a central development team or even a central design team. You can define a set of layouts and then make those available for an editor to, let's say, pick from one of 5 different layouts that have been sort of carefully put together and thoroughly tested to provide a good and compelling experience. A popular alternative to Layout Builder is Paragraphs, which is, I would say, less visual, but probably harder to break. It does also allow the ability to have nested layouts, which can add more complexity. Some people will also use Paragraphs for almost like field collections. So let's say you've got contact information you want to add on your event content type, and it's 3 fields, but you could have multiple sets of those. Paragraphs can be used for that, but I would say if that's your only use case, something like Paragraphs is going to be overkill. Some people use Paragraphs and Layout Builder together. I personally don't have a lot of experience with that, but I would also say if you're using Paragraphs, particularly for very complex layouts, the Paragraphs Edit module can be really useful because it allows authors to use the contextual menu to edit the content of a particular component without having to sort of go into the edit interface, look at a long list of paragraphs and sort of figure out which one had the information that they want to edit. So a few additional thoughts in terms of how we can simplify that editorial experience. A lot of users during testing will say that, particularly for complex sort of content types or content development tasks, they would actually prefer to be able to clone something existing and then alter it to what they need. And so the entity clone module can be a pretty easy way to provide that kind of functionality. Some, particularly like a news system, may make use of sort of the date of a piece of content, but oftentimes the sort of, Drupalism of the created date actually isn't as useful as site builders we might think, because it's really the date at which the author originally hit save, as opposed to the time it was available to anonymous users. And so there may be a bit of a disconnect in terms of using that as your sort of like canonical date for a piece of content. So there's this publication date module that can be really useful because first off, it makes it really obvious where the field is to alter that. So let's just show here as an example, if we go back to our default Drupal site, to be able to find where this date can be altered, you have to kind of know to scroll down here and then open up this, and then it's down here, which again, a novice user may not really realize exactly where to find that. Whereas the publication date module has this set of fields that it puts in a really prominent place, makes it obvious, and it even has kind of help text to say, leave this blank to use the time that the content is actually published. You may also want to think about that content view that we saw before, and are there ways to actually turn that into more of a dashboard? So as a list, it's useful, but you could easily just spend a few minutes and customize the filters that are exposed there. So, in the default install that I have, it is using, let's say, language as a filter. But if your site really only has English content, then it might be more useful to allow filtering based on, the author of the content. Or if you've got subtypes like, event type, or, some of those other things, then customizing that to exactly your use case can be, as I say, kind of a quick fix and a way to really increase the usability of that particular view. You might also want to consider that moderated content view that we saw for the editor, turn that into more of a block and put those two on the same page, so that in a single page, you can have more of a holistic view of sort of the priorities of your website. There is also this content planner module, which provides a pretty sophisticated interface. It has the ability to even bring in sort of Google Analytics data and show you that. It has a calendar to show scheduled content and when everything is going live. And so if your website is very content heavy in terms of, let's say, managing lots of content that's going live on the blog over a variety of days, maybe even from a multitude of authors, then something like Content Planner can be really useful. Also, documentation is going to be really important for your site. And in my experience, users tend to read it less before they start working with a website, but are going to find it really useful to have that documentation handy when they hit a snag in terms of trying to perform a particular task. And so making sure that the documentation you provide is scannable is going to be really important, and particularly having steps clearly indicated so that they can identify where they are in the process and then kind of read up from there to understand how do they get to the next step. Including screen captures can definitely improve the usefulness of that documentation. And also think about what's the best format. Some organizations, for example, can't use Google Docs. It might even be sort of, blocked in their firewall. And so understanding what's going to be the best format for, a particular set of users is also an important consideration. We've also found videos can be really helpful, particularly for sort of more visual learners, and also if it's demonstrating more of a process. There is the free Loom screen recorder, but if you are using the free plan, know that the videos will expire after a period of time, so you can download them and potentially make them available through another means. In Drupal core, there are also the tour and help topics modules, but obviously require some work to get those actually into your site, but it can be powerful to have that kind of assistance built directly into the website. So final thought is that, you should really think about this usability effort as more of a process than a destination. Don't assume that, because you go in and either set up the site great initially or go in and do a bunch of work, that then you can sort of walk away and never think about it again. You should really be thinking about it as something that will require some ongoing fine tuning. Test as much as possible. So the Steve Krug book that we talked about earlier, he has another book called Rocket Science Made Easy that talks about kind of a more informal approach to usability testing. And if you use something like that, then it's a low cost way to sort of do ongoing testing, ideally during the initial development, but even post launch to help inform. Are there some roadmap issues that are needed to keep that editorial experience as usable as possible? I would encourage you as kind of a site builder and developer to eat your own dog food. So try to spend some time yourself actually entering real data to get a sense of where are the pain points. Are there certain things that feel unnecessarily repetitive, or maybe there are certain things that early on we thought were going to be necessities, but as it turned out, add a lot of complexity and aren't actually really needed that often. And above all, try and get feedback from the people that are actually using the system on a daily basis. And try to roll out changes, I would say, in kind of small increments so that you can get feedback, make sure that they are actually providing benefits to the people using it, and then either readjust or kind of move on to the next thing. So the last slide here is just some articles that might be useful if you want to do some more reading around this topic of how you can make your CMS as usable as possible for your editors. And with that, I will open it up for any questions or comments.
That was really great. Thanks so much. Would you mind sharing that link in the chat? I can post it to the website.
For the slides?
The slides, yeah.
Sure. Don't think I have it right now. Actually, well, I can leave it here and I'll start working on getting these. Usually what I do is I'll post these to SlideShare.
Okay.
So I can start that process, but also if there are any questions, I can dive into those. So
looks like David Tom's asking, what was the name of the accessibility module you posted?
It's editorially. So and the tricky part is that the L's are actually one, so it's editorially there. I can actually put that in the chat too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think there was I want to say there was a session at DrupalCon a bit by the author of this. And so once those are released, the session recordings, I heard it was like end of May. They're expected to be publicly available. You can watch that session and learn about the module.
Oh, that's a good point for everyone here. This session is recorded and we'll try to get it posted as soon as we can. We'll send an email out to the mailing list as soon as we have that.
Great. Karina?
I have a quick question about the inline form. I'm not sure it was inline form. When you were saving location, there was a configuration that allowed you to save location, create new location or save new location. I missed that. I know it will be recorded, but I just wanted to use an opportunity to ask.
Yeah, of course. So let me go back into that form. So I think what you're referring to is this here, where you can either add a new location.
So what was how did you configure, added like the other one? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is using a module called Inline Entity Form.
Inline Entity Form? Mm-hmm.
Yep. Actually, if I switch back to here. And if
I remember using it with conjunctions with, it was like a media.
So yeah, before Media Library was in core, that was a solution that would get used pretty often to create a similar experience. Personally, I find the Media Library I mean, specifically for managing, like attaching images to content and so on, I find the media library a bit smoother of a process, but it still can be useful for a variety of managing inline entity forms. So it has a couple of different variations. When you go in here,
right.
here's where you can customize those labels. And then if you're using Entity Browser on your website, you can also, instead of just doing the autocomplete, you can configure like an Entity Browser, which if you're talking about content where people may not know the name of the thing that they're looking for, using more of an Entity Browser approach can be much better. So.
Got it. Thank you. Now I remember, because I remember seeing it, but I forgot where it was. And I was like, oh, that's very cool. But there was this entity browser that comes along with the inline entity form. Got it. Thanks.
Welcome. Any other questions?
Great session. Thank you.
Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, there was a lot of really great links in there.
Great. Yeah, I'll probably even be able to get this posted before the next session.
Yeah, feel free to just send it to me directly in chat and I'll post it to the session page.
Okay, sounds great. Is there anything anybody wanted to see more detail around?
I would just say thanks to, sorry, no camera. I'm done eating my pancakes, but I probably still have pancakes in my face. Thanks for spending the time and effort into that authoring environment. We found that's a huge game changer in our work. And obviously, I know that there's been emphasis in the Drupal world on editing, but it still needs a lot of work. It still needs to come along. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing all this great information with everyone, and good stuff.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned that there was, you had done some work that it sounds like was fairly transformative in terms of the usability. Any key elements that you found particularly contributed to that?
Yeah, we locked this thing down, way down. And part of it was the research that we had done previously in our previous version of our Stanford sites. David Tom, manager UX and design, Stanford Web Services. For Stanford sites, it was pretty much open. Our authors could do pretty much anything they wanted to. And what we found is at the time that made sense because most of the folks around campus were more technically oriented. There were fewer people contributing content, but those people were a little more sophisticated from an overall content web authoring kind of thing, because they're often the web manager of an area. Over time, that work became more and more distributed towards folks that were less technical and more about content. And so having our focus on content creation, and that just happens to be a CMS, kind of going more on a web publishing tool and simplifying heavily. Research showed that our average site had about 20 pages and 3 content types, and every site had 3 content types because that's the way our site was structured. Our content system was structured. So by doing that, we really simplified things. And so we've been, that's the way we launched, and we've been adding functionality to kind of add flexibility with more sophisticated types of content management functions rather than web publishing functions, right? So we kind of went out with a web publishing mindset, mostly static sites. And then we've been adding kind of the CMS, more dynamic features over time, and they're still coming out. But that made a big difference for the ability for users just to come in and use our product with kind of, we get help from Irina on trainings, but we don't do as many trainings as we used to. And they're simpler and faster. So hopefully people are able to use it in a much easier way without, heavy training.
Pretty cool. Yeah, appreciate the insights.
I have to say, having been a power user in the older sites platform and now using the new one, I really don't think you need to tell new content authors that this is a Drupal site. There's really no Drupal feel about it in Stanford sites. So it's kind of nice.
Yeah, and we realized that we were kind of splitting our market a little bit in that we, more sophisticated users who had more custom work that needed to be done, we knew that they were not going to be as, served by this new version of the product. From a business standpoint, we were in the process of trying to migrate all of these, almost 2,000 sites of Drupal 7 sites into the new platform. So that was our number one priority from a business standpoint, is to get these sites moved. And that's the type of sites that those were those more simple sites. So that's where we focused on the work that we did. But a lot of the things that you're doing are it's funny, your approaches were different than some of the ones that we took. But if I just read, the principles that you were using, that could have applied to what we were doing. Absolutely. So sure. Yeah, lovely.
Awesome. I did post the link in the chat for the slides. So
thanks. I'm posting it right now.
Awesome. Irina, did you have another comment?
I just wanted to actually comment on Dave's his comment that for average user, they really don't need to know whether it's Drupal, WordPress. It's just a content management web publishing system. And that's been a goal for many years, to emphasize this editorial experience and making things easy for content editors so they can concentrate on content, on having opportunity to make their site beautiful, accessible, useful, and not learn things that really are not applicable for them. So great job, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like, sort of optimized well enough, a Drupal site, nobody should have to learn what a node is, or, some of those other very sort of Drupal specific things. If you can really make the experience as easy as possible, then I think from an organization standpoint, it means you can get people working on those that really have more of like a, writing and communication skill set, and let them do the work that they're best suited for. And then, you can have a web team that can, make those ongoing improvements, but they're not having to sort of handhold or do as much support for your sort of content authors, which I think is best for everybody. So since we have a couple of minutes, maybe I'll also mention there, I noticed the other day there was talk about Acquia and how Stanford uses Acquia quite a bit. I didn't get in the sort of layout section talking about Acquia Site Studio, but it's also obviously another sort of very intuitive and I think pretty powerful way of providing some of those layout capabilities. I would say, to me, if anything, it's actually better in terms of allowing you to potentially set, kind of guardrails in terms of, you can do things like easily define, let's say, a color palette that editors can use for, as a background color for a component that has, let's say, a video and some text and some of those kinds of things. So you can give them a lot of control, but also put parameters around it to make sure that they're, following colors that are in the corporate brand palette or some of those other things. And it's actually a really useful tool, but obviously that could be a whole kind of session unto itself.
Yeah, it's interesting that for us to be able to develop this in-house and the choices that we made, we had to go live with one theme, and we're trying to figure out, okay, so there was a session yesterday at noon, and when we were talking about sub-themes, but we're still just starting to add that ability to our platform. And yeah, at one point when we brought up the word levers or controls or those types of things, our product owner's head would blow up. And like it became comical because it's so complex and so hard to do it right. So it was pretty funny. But yeah, those are some of the things that over time we're right now we're offering as custom but we will, start to integrate probably some optional choices that people can make to differentiate their sites over time. But that's definitely further down. There's other things that are more important from a business standpoint. We still have to do unbranded, and we're in the process of launching Subsite and intranet. So those things are coming, but this other stuff, yeah, we'll definitely have to bring in later.
For sure.
We looked a lot at that, plus I forget that the company that Acquia bought that kind of allowed full customization.
Cohesion, I think, was the company. I think the product was originally called DX8, and then after Acquia bought it, they called the product Cohesion until they rebranded it as Site Studio.
Yeah, that. And then there's that even simpler one that they showed yesterday, or simpler version of it, I think.
Yeah, so I think what I heard, I don't think I've actually had a chance to see it yet, is that they've made Site Studio more like Layout Builder in the sense of actually showing more of a preview as you're like dragging around your elements. So as opposed to just showing like blocks with labels, they're actually giving you kind of like a little preview so that it looks more like what the layout is going to look like when you save the updated layouts, which I think is going to be a really useful feature. So
for sure.
Okay, I actually need to hop to the next session. Are there any more questions before we end?
Just wanted to say thank you. Great session and great discussion. David, thanks a lot for all the comments, because they are, it's a great product and everyone loves using it. And I think that some level of sub-theming and addressing the question for people who are looking for more, or more customized design, it's great. It's like awesome news. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you bet. And thanks to Martin for doing this presentation and sharing his wisdom with the crowd. It's helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you,
everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.